was supposed to be a solo trip, a chance to clear my head and escape the chaos of life for a weekend. I'd picked a remote trail in Colorado, one I'd read about online. It was challenging but manageable, with breathtaking views. Perfect for someone like me, an experienced hiker who preferred solitude. The first day was everything I'd hoped for. Clear skies, the soothing sound of the wind through the pines, and not another soul in sight. But that all changed on the second day. I'd just packed up camp that morning and was heading toward the trail's midpoint, where I planned to set up for the night. That's when I saw him. A man in his mid-30s, wearing a baseball cap and a slightly oversized backpack, walking toward me from the opposite direction. He looked normal enough, clean-shaven, friendly smile, the kind of person you wouldn't think twice about seeing on a trail. As we passed, he stopped and asked if I'd mind if he'd join me for a bit. "I've been hiking solo for a few days," he said, his voice light and casual. "It'd be nice to have some company." I hesitated. Normally, I would have said no. I liked hiking alone, but he seemed harmless, and honestly, part of me felt rude for refusing. So I nodded and said, "Sure, why not?" That was my first mistake. At first, he was perfectly fine. He told me his name was Derek, and he was hiking the same trail, but in the opposite direction. We swapped small talk, where we were from, favorite hikes. He even shared some granola bars with me when we stopped for a quick break. But after an hour, things started to feel off. He asked a lot of questions, too many and too personal. Where did I live? Was I hiking alone? Did I have a boyfriend or a husband waiting for me? I tried to brush it off, telling myself he was just chatty, but something about the way he watched me when I answered made my skin crawl. Then he started making little comments. Nothing overtly threatening, but just enough to unsettle me. "You're pretty brave to hike out here all alone," he said with a smirk. "Anything could happen to you, and no one would know for days." I laughed nervously, trying to change the subject. But the more we talked, the more I realized he wasn't sharing much about himself. Every time I asked him a question, he'd deflect or give vague answers. That's when I decided it was time to part ways. I told Derek I needed to pick up my pace to make it to my next campsite before dark, hoping he'd take the hint and let me go. But instead, he smiled and said, "No problem, I'll keep up." My stomach dropped. For the next mile, I tried everything I could think of to shake him. Slowing down, speeding up, stopping to check my map. But no matter what I did, he stayed right there, matching my every move. By now, the easygoing friendly vibe was gone. Derek's smile had faded, and his eyes seemed different. Farther. Colder. I realized I was completely alone with a stranger in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest road, and no cell service. Panic started to creep in, but I knew I had to stay calm. If he sensed my fear, I'd lose any advantage I had. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, I spotted a fork in the trail ahead. One path leading deeper into the woods, the other veering toward a small creek I'd seen on the map. I stopped abruptly and turned to Derek. "This is where I'm heading," I said, pointing to the creek. "Thanks for the company, but I'll be fine from here." For a moment he just stared at me, then he smiled again, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. "You sure?" he asked, his voice almost mocking. "It's getting dark. Wouldn't want you to get lost." "I'll be fine," I repeated, forcing as much confidence into my voice as I could. He didn't move. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he shrugged and said, "Suit yourself." I watched as he walked down the other trail, his figure disappearing into the trees, but I didn't relax. Not yet. I waited 5 minutes before I started walking again, constantly glancing over my shoulder. For a while I thought I was in the clear. Then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly I turned, and there he was, less than 50 yards away, staring in the middle of the trail, staring at me. He didn't say anything, didn't move. He just stood there, like he was daring me to run. And I did. I bolted off the trail and into the woods, branches tearing at my clothes and skin as I stumbled through the underbrush. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. I could hear him crashing through the woods behind me, shouting something I couldn't make out. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't stop. Finally, I spotted a cluster of boulders ahead and ducked behind them, crouching low and holding my breath. I could hear him searching, his footsteps growing closer and closer. But then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. I waited there, motionless, until the sun had completely set and the forest was pitch black. Only then did I dare to move. I made it to the creek hours later, soaked, exhausted, and shaking. I set up a makeshift camp and didn't sleep a second that night. The next morning, I hiked back to the trailhead as fast as I could. I never reported it. I couldn't even be sure what I'd say. But I haven't hiked alone since, and I never will again. Some people say the scariest thing in the wilderness is the wildlife, but I've learned the hard way. It's not the bears or the wolves you have to worry about. It's the people. I'd picked this trail in northern Arizona after seeing photos of its breathtaking views, a rugged path that cut through dense forests and rocky outcrops. It was a remote area, but that was part of the appeal. No cell service, no crowds, just me and nature. I started early in the morning, energized and eager to make it to a scenic ridge about 5 miles in. The hike was challenging, with steep inclines and uneven terrain, but nothing I couldn't handle. I had my water, some snacks, and a small first aid kit I'd barely touched in years of hiking. The day was perfect. Sunlight filtered through the trees. The air was crisp, and I felt unstoppable. At least, until it happened. I was about 3 miles in when I decided to take a shortcut off the main trail. It wasn't marked, but it looked like it would save me some time. The ground was soft and uneven, with loose dirt and hidden roots. I was stepping carefully, but I let my guard down for just a moment. My foot caught on something, I'm still not sure what, and suddenly I was falling. The impact wasn't the worst part. It was the sickening pop I heard as my ankle twisted beneath me. The pain was instant and overwhelming. I sat there clutching my leg, hoping it was just a sprain. But when I tried to stand, the searing pain made it clear there was no way I was walking out of there. Panic started to set in as I realized how isolated I was. The main trail was at least half a mile back, and I hadn't seen another hiker all day. I reached for my phone, but of course, there was no signal. I tried to calm myself, telling myself someone would come along eventually. But as the hours ticked by and the forest grew quieter, that hope started to fade. The sun was dipping lower, and the shadows stretched long across the forest floor. I needed a plan. Sitting there waiting wasn't going to get me out. But every time I moved, the pain in my ankle made me want to scream. With the light fading, I decided to focus on surviving the night. I used my trekking poles to drag myself to a nearby cluster of trees, where the ground was a little more sheltered. I gathered what I could for a makeshift shelter: branches, leaves, anything to insulate me from the cold ground. My water bottle was half full, and I rationed it, sipping sparingly. As the sun set completely, the forest came alive with sounds: crickets, rustling leaves, and distant howls that made my stomach churn. Every sound felt amplified in the dark, every shadow a potential threat. The pain in my ankle throbbed relentlessly, and I couldn't stop replaying the moment of the fall in my mind. Over and over, I berated myself for leaving the main trail, for not packing more supplies, for hiking alone in the first place. At some point in the night, I heard a rustling sound, too deliberate to be the wind. My heart raced as I scanned the darkness, my flashlight shaking in my hand. Then I saw them, eyes glowing in the beam of my flashlight. They were low to the ground, watching me from a distance. Coyotes. I knew they rarely attacked humans, but I was injured and alone, a perfect target if they were hungry enough. I grabbed the largest stick I could find and waved it, shouting to scare them off. They backed away, but didn't leave completely. I could see their silhouettes pacing just beyond the edge of the light. The rest of the night was a blur of adrenaline and exhaustion. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear a noise and snap awake, gripping my makeshift weapon. When dawn finally broke, I was exhausted, dehydrated, and in worse pain than ever. But the daylight gave me a renewed sense of determination. Using my trekking poles as crutches, I started the slow, agonizing process of dragging myself back toward the main trail. Every step felt like torture, but I forced myself to keep going. Hours later, I heard voices, a group of hikers coming up the trail. I called out, my voice hoarse from dehydration and yelling at coyotes all night. When they found me, they couldn't believe I'd made it that far on my own. They gave me water, helped splint my ankle, and used their GPS to call for help. It took another hour for the rescue team to arrive, but when they did, I'd never been so relieved in my life. The doctors said I was lucky. My ankle was broken, but it could have been much worse if I hadn't stabilized it. I learned a lot that day about preparation, about humility, and about how quickly things can go wrong in the wilderness. Now, I never step foot on a trail without a fully stocked pack, a personal locator beacon, and a healthy respect for the dangers of hiking alone. And every time I hear a coyote howl, I'm reminded of that night, of how close I came to being just another story lost to the wilderness. It had been a long week, and all I wanted was to get out into nature. The trail I chose was one I'd hiked a few times before, a moderate loop in a quiet state park about an hour from the nearest town. I parked in the small gravel lot at the trailhead, one of only 2 cars there. The other was an old beat-up sedan that didn't look like it had been moved in weeks. The hike itself was beautiful, the crisp air, the golden leaves crunching underfoot. It was exactly what I needed. I spent a couple of hours wandering the trail, taking photos, and enjoying the solitude. I didn't see a single other person the entire time, which made it feel like I had the whole forest to myself. But as I made my way back to the parking lot, something felt off. At first, I thought it was just the encroaching darkness or the eerie silence that seemed to settle over the woods. But then I saw my car. My first thought was that it couldn't be my car. But as I got closer, the reality hit me like a punch to the gut. The driver's side window was shattered, and there was glass everywhere. Some of it scattered to the right, some of it scattered to the left, and some of it was tearing through the truck. My heart started pounding as I realized the door was slightly ajar. I reached for my phone to call for help, but when I checked my pocket, it wasn't there. Then I remembered. I'd left it in the car, along with my wallet, my keys, and my emergency bag. I opened the door and felt a wave of panic. The inside had been ransacked. The glove compartment was hanging open, and everything that had been in the car was gone. My water, my snacks, even the spare jacket I'd left in the back seat, it was all missing. At first I just stood there, staring at the car in disbelief. I kept thinking, this can't be happening. But the sinking feeling in my stomach told me otherwise. I checked the trunk, hoping maybe the thieves had left something behind. But it was empty too. Even the small gas can I kept for emergencies was gone. That's when I noticed the second car. The beat-up sedan I'd seen earlier. It was gone. Whoever had been driving it must have waited for me to leave and then broken into my car while I was on the trail. The thought of someone watching me, waiting for me to be out of sight, sent a shiver down my spine. Outside the driver's zone, the silence of the cabin, although probably just pans on a choice, had already taken the second car, and now they were gone, leaving me stranded miles from anywhere. Night was falling fast, and the temperature was dropping. I knew I couldn't stay in the car. It wasn't safe, and it wouldn't do much to keep me warm anyway. I debated my options. The nearest ranger station was 5 miles away, but it was already after hours. There was no guarantee anyone would be there. The main road was even farther, and I didn't relish the idea of walking along a dark, empty highway in the middle of the night. I thought about staying in the parking lot, but the idea of those people coming back, maybe realizing I was still here, was too terrifying to consider. So I started walking. I grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment. It was the one thing they hadn't taken, and headed toward the ranger station. The trail leading out of the parking lot was eerily quiet. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the gravel and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Every shadow felt like it was hiding something, or someone. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced I was being followed. About halfway to the station, I heard it. Footsteps. Not mine. They were heavier, uneven, and coming from behind me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned off my flashlight and crouched low, trying to make myself as small and invisible as possible. The footsteps got closer, then stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear anything. But after a few agonizing minutes, the sound faded away. I waited another 5 minutes before daring to turn the flashlight back on, and when I did, I ran. By the time I reached the ranger station, I was out of breath, my legs burning from the effort. But when I got there, the building was dark. The doors were locked, and there was no sign of anyone inside. I pounded on the door, shouting for help. But the only response was the echo of my own voice. I slumped against the wall, trying to figure out what to do next. That's when I saw the headlights. A car was coming up the road, its beams cutting through the darkness. Relief flooded through me. until I realized it was the same beat-up sedan from earlier. I panicked, ducking behind the station and turning off my flashlight. I watched as the car pulled into the small parking lot, its engine idling. The driver got out. A man in a dirty jacket with a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He walked around to the back of the car, opened the trunk, and pulled something out. It was a crowbar. I don't know how he didn't hear my heart pounding, but I stayed as still as I could, hidden in the shadows. He paced around for a while, shining a flashlight into the woods like he was looking for something or someone. After what felt like an eternity, he got back in the car and drove off. I waited another hour before I felt safe enough to leave my hiding spot. Eventually, I decided to walk back toward the main road, hoping to flag down a passing car. It took hours, but just as the sun was coming up, a park maintenance truck came down the road. The driver was shocked to see me and immediately radioed for help. When I told him about the break-in and the man with the crowbar, his face went pale. Apparently, there had been reports of thefts and attacks in the area recently, but they hadn't caught the person responsible yet. He told me I was lucky to be alive. I never did get my belongings back, and the man with the sedan was never caught. Now, whenever I go hiking, I make sure to leave my valuables at home and park in more populated areas. But no matter how much time passes, I'll never forget that night. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, and of realizing just how vulnerable I was. I'd planned this hike for weeks, a solo trip through a stunning national park in Washington. I'd always loved hiking alone. It gave me a sense of freedom, a chance to disconnect from everything and just breathe. The trail I chose was popular but long, winding its way up to a gorgeous overlook. It wasn't heavily trafficked this time of year, but I wasn't worried. I was experienced and prepared. Or at least, I thought I was. I was about 2 hours in, making good progress when I saw him. A man in a ranger uniform standing just off the trail. He was tall, maybe mid-40s, with a friendly face and a wide-brimmed hat. "Morning," he called out, giving me a wave. I stopped and smiled. "Morning. Beautiful day, isn't it?" He nodded. "Sure is. You heading to the overlook?" I told him I was, and he grinned. "You're in for a treat, but the trail gets rough up ahead. Rock slides took out part of that last week. I can show you a shortcut. It's not marked, but it'll save you a good half hour and get you to an even better view." I hesitated. I'd read nothing about a shortcut, but he was a ranger, an authority figure. Why would he lie? "That sounds great," I said, smiling, and just like that I followed him off the main trail. The path he led me down wasn't really a path at all. It was narrow, overgrown, and steep, but he moved confidently, like he knew exactly where he was going. We chatted as we walked, about the park, the wildlife, and the hikes we'd both done. He was charming, knowledgeable, and completely disarming. For one thing, the trail kept getting steeper and harder to navigate, and then there was the silence. No other hikers, no distant sounds of the main trail, just us and the crunch of leaves underfoot. Finally, I asked, "How much farther is it?" He stopped and turned to me, his smile tight. "Not far now, just a little bit ahead." But his tone had shifted, less friendly, more impatient. And that's when I noticed something else, his uniform. The badge on his chest didn't have the park's name, just a generic emblem, And the patches on his sleeves, they didn't match any of the official ranger uniforms I'd seen before. A chill ran down my spine. As we kept walking, I started looking for excuses to slow down, to think. "So, how long have you been working here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Oh, a few years," he said quickly, not meeting my eyes. Something about his answer felt rehearsed, like he'd said it 100 times before. And then I saw it. Something sticking out of his back pocket. A knife. My heart started pounding. I told myself it was probably just for safety, for cutting ropes or clearing brush, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in serious danger. Finally, I stopped. "You know what? I think I'm just going to head back to the main trail. I don't want to lose track of time." He turned to face me, his expression blank. "You sure? You're so close." "I'm sure," I said. For a moment, he just stared at me. Then he shrugged. "Suit yourself. But be careful heading back. It's easy to get lost out here." He didn't move. He just stood there, watching as I turned and started walking back the way we'd come. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I didn't want to tip him off. I kept my pace steady, my breathing even, until I was sure I was out of sight. Then I took off, crashing through the underbrush, desperate to put as much distance as I could between us. I didn't care about staying on the trail. All I cared about was getting back to the main path. Behind me, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Heavy footsteps, without getting louder. He was following me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just kept running, my legs burning, my heart hammering in my chest. Finally, I spotted the main trail ahead and practically threw myself onto it. I looked around, frantic, but there was no one else in sight. And then, silence. No footsteps, no rustling, nothing. He was gone, though I didn't stop. I sprinted all the way back to the trailhead, my mind racing with what had just happened. When I got to the ranger station, I told them everything. The shortcut, the uniform, the knife. The ranger on duty frowned. "We don't have anyone matching that description working here," he said, "and there are no shortcuts to the overlook." My stomach dropped. They called the police, but as far as I know, they never found him. And the thought that he's still out there, wearing that uniform, luring other hikers off the trail, it's something I'll never stop thinking about. I still hike, but never alone. And I'll never trust a stranger in the woods again, no matter what they're wearing. That's it for today's tale from Shivering Vault. If you have a story worth sharing, drop it in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your fellow thrill seekers. As always, the Shivering Vault thanks you for unlocking today's tale. Until next time, the vault awaits your return.